Silence, the kind it began behind the sealed doors of Windsor Castle, where even senior aides were ordered to wait outside. What was supposed to be a routine discussion about royal succession suddenly erupted into something far darker. Witnesses say Prince William's expression changed instantly the moment the children's titles were mentioned. Minutes later, the future king stormed out of the council chamber in absolute fury, leaving stunned officials frozen in silence. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For weeks, there had already been an unusual tension surrounding the palace. Royal insiders whispered that something significant was unfolding behind closed doors while King Charles continued quietly battling the health struggles that have shadowed the monarchy since early 2024. Publicly, officials insisted the institution remained stable. Behind the scenes, however, reports suggest senior courtiers had begun accelerating discussions about the crown's long-term future, particularly the structure of the monarchy once William eventually ascends the throne. What nobody expected was that those discussions would center on William's own children. According to sources familiar with the private council gathering, the meeting had originally been presented as a confidential review of succession logistics and future royal responsibilities. These types of discussions are not unusual within royal circles, especially during periods of uncertainty surrounding the sovereign's health. But insiders now claim the atmosphere inside the chamber shifted dramatically once palace advisors allegedly introduced proposals connected to what they described as a streamlined monarchy. That phrase alone reportedly caused visible discomfort among several senior figures in attendance. Because within royal history, those words carry consequences far beyond public appearances or ceremonial duties. They touch inheritance, status, legacy, bloodline. And then came the moment that reportedly blindsided Prince William entirely. Various interpretations of the meeting suggest advisors began outlining possible future limitations regarding the formal royal positions of Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis once George eventually becomes king. Reports remain heavily guarded, but insiders whisper that discussions included future official responsibilities, adjusting long-term title structures, and creating a much smaller circle of working royals for the next generation. While George's position as direct heir was never questioned, Charlotte and Louis were suddenly being discussed not simply as beloved royal children but as institutional liabilities within a modern monarchy trying desperately to survive changing public opinion. Those familiar with William's fiercely protective nature say the reaction was immediate. Palace staff reportedly noticed the future king's demeanor harden almost instantly as the conversation progressed. One insider claimed the room became unbearably tense, with several aides avoiding eye contact altogether. Sources close to the Wales household now suggest Catherine had privately warned William beforehand that certain figures inside the institution were pushing far more aggressively for modernization than expected. But even she allegedly did not anticipate the conversation escalating to their own children so directly. The emotional weight of the discussion reportedly became impossible to ignore once Charlotte's name surfaced repeatedly throughout the proposal. Silence, the kind to whispers circulating among royal correspondents, William viewed the entire framework as dangerously close to creating another dynamic inside the family, a mistake many believe permanently damaged Prince Harry's relationship with the monarchy decades earlier. The idea that Louis or Charlotte could grow up feeling secondary within the institution reportedly struck a deeply personal nerve, especially because William himself witnessed firsthand what unchecked royal hierarchy can do to siblings raised inside the shadow of the crown. By the final stage of the meeting, insiders claim voices inside the chamber had risen sharply. Officials allegedly attempted to reassure William that nothing had been finalized, insisting these were merely strategic projections tied to future public funding concerns and long-term constitutional planning, but the damage had already been done. Witnesses say William abruptly stood from the table, visibly furious, before leaving the room without waiting for the discussion to conclude. The silence afterward, according to one palace source, was devastating. Senior aides immediately scrambled to contain the fallout, while communications teams were quiet. Silence, the kind instructed to monitor potential leaks before rumors reached the press. Yet what truly unsettled veteran palace figures was not simply William's anger, but the realization that the future king no longer appeared willing to quietly tolerate decisions being made about his family behind closed doors. Because inside the House of Windsor, power has always depended on silence, restraint, and carefully managed compromise. But something about this confrontation felt different, more personal, more dangerous, and as whispers of the explosive council meeting slowly began spreading through royal circles, attention quickly turned toward a far older and more chilling possibility buried deep within the monarchy's past. But the explosive argument inside that chamber was only the beginning, because hidden within the proposal was a decision tied to a decades-old royal strategy few believed still existed. Long before William ever became heir to the throne, another royal quietly shaped a contingency plan for the monarchy's survival. And according to palace insiders, that forgotten doctrine may have suddenly returned with devastating consequences for William's children. The deeper investigators began digging into the explosive council confrontation, the clearer it became that this was never simply about Charlotte or Louis alone. Reports suggest the argument inside Windsor Castle was tied to a much older philosophy buried deep within the institution itself, a strategy designed decades ago to protect the monarchy from public backlash, financial scrutiny, and the growing belief that the royal family had become too large, too expensive, and too disconnected from ordinary life. What shocked William, according to insiders, was discovering that the proposal placed before him may not have been some temporary recommendation created during King Charles's illness. It may have been the revival of a royal doctrine quietly waiting for the right moment to return. For years, royal experts such as Robert Hardman and Ingrid Seward have spoken about King Charles's long-standing vision of a slimmed-down monarchy. Even during the final years of Queen Elizabeth II's reign, reports frequently emerged suggesting Charles believed the future survival of the crown depended on reducing the number of senior working royals carrying titles, security costs, residences, and public obligations. At the time, silence, the kind any dismissed those discussions as harmless modernization. But inside palace circles, whispers now suggest the concept was always far more serious than the public realized. Because once a monarchy begins deciding which members remain central to the institution and which quietly fade into the background, the consequences become deeply personal, especially for children born into the system without choosing it. Sources familiar with the palace's internal strategy meetings claim advisors have grown increasingly anxious about public opinion surrounding the royal family since early 2024. King Charles's health struggles reportedly intensified fears that the institution may soon face a dangerous period of instability. Public sympathy remains high for certain royals, particularly William and Catherine, but insiders whisper that officials worry younger generations across Britain no longer view monarchy with the same unquestioning loyalty seen decades ago. And within those discussions, the issue of cost reportedly keeps resurfacing again and again. Too many titles, too many households, too many royals competing for relevance inside a modern constitutional system under constant media scrutiny. Silence, the kind that is where the terrifying distinction between George, Charlotte, and Louis allegedly entered the conversation. According to palace administrative leaks, George's future role as heir was never debated because his constitutional position is untouchable. But Charlotte and Louis, despite their enormous popularity, were reportedly viewed differently by certain advisors precisely because they are not direct heirs to the throne. Some insiders allegedly argued that future generations of heirs create long-term political complications for the institution, referencing historical tensions that have haunted the monarchy for decades. And for William, that comparison struck at the heart of one of the family's deepest wounds. Because nobody understands the emotional destruction of the spare system more intimately than a prince who watched his own brother become consumed by it. Reports now suggest William interpreted the entire proposal not as strategic modernization, but as the beginning of a dangerous fracture within his family. Those close to the Prince of Wales claim he has spent years trying to ensure George, Charlotte, and Louis grow up emotionally connected rather than institutionally sided. Catherine, meanwhile, is said to have become deeply troubled by the psychological consequences such royal distinctions could create as the children grow older. Palace insiders whisper that she fears history repeating itself in silence, where one child carries the full burden of destiny while the others slowly drift into emotional uncertainty beneath the enormous shadow of the crown. And perhaps most unsettling of all was the growing realization that this doctrine may not have emerged recently at all. Various interpretations suggest traces of the strategy can be linked back to late-stage discussions during Queen Elizabeth II's reign, when palace officials quietly debated how the monarchy could survive future political and financial pressures. Back then, the Queen reportedly managed title decisions with extraordinary caution, always balancing duty with family unity. But now, with Charles weakened and William preparing for eventual kingship, insiders fear old institutional mechanisms are resurfacing more aggressively than ever before. Yet what truly shattered William's trust was not the proposal itself, but discovering who may have quietly supported it behind palace walls. For our years, William believed the inner royal circle stood firmly behind his family. But insiders now claim a quiet alliance had been forming in secret, one that may have influenced the shocking recommendation placed before the council. As the fallout from the Windsor meeting continued spreading through royal corridors, attention quietly shifted away from the proposal itself and toward the people believed to be standing behind it. Because within the monarchy, controversial ideas rarely emerge from a single conversation. They are cultivated slowly, reinforced privately, and protected by networks of influence that often remain invisible to the public. And according to multiple palace insiders, the recommendation involving Charlotte and Louis may have been supported by a growing faction of senior courtiers who believe the monarchy must dramatically reinvent itself in order to survive the next generation. Reports suggest these internal divisions have existed for years beneath the surface of the institution. On one side stand the traditionalists, figures deeply loyal to the late Queen Elizabeth II's philosophy of stability, continuity, and cautious evolution. On the other side are the reform silence, the kind-minded advisors who reportedly believe the monarchy faces a dangerous future unless it becomes leaner, less ceremonial, and far more politically defensible to taxpayers. What once existed as quiet ideological disagreement has now, according to insiders, evolved into a full-scale struggle over the identity of the crown itself. And William's children have suddenly found themselves at the center of it. Those familiar with the palace's internal administrative circles claim certain officials privately argued that Charlotte and Louis should eventually occupy significantly smaller royal roles than previous generations of royal siblings, not because of personal animosity, but because of institutional calculation. Reports suggest advisors fear Britain is entering an era where public tolerance for royal spending could weaken dramatically, especially during periods of economic strain and political division. Within that context, every title, every residence, every taxpayer-funded protection detail reportedly becomes part of a larger debate about whether the monarchy still reflects modern Britain or remains trapped inside traditions the public no longer wishes to finance indefinitely. But for William, the issue was never about finances, it was about family. And insiders now whisper that his frustration with palace bureaucracy has been building quietly for years. Behind the polished appearances and carefully managed public unity, the Prince of Wales reportedly grew increasingly uneasy with what he viewed as a cold institutional mindset inside certain royal departments. The same system that once protected the monarchy now appeared, in his eyes, capable of emotionally isolating his own children in the name of survival. That realization changed something fundamental in him, because unlike previous heirs who often accepted palace strategy without resistance, William reportedly began viewing the machinery of the institution itself with suspicion. Catherine's reaction, according to those close to the Wales household, was equally intense though far more personal. Sources whisper she was furious not only about the substance of the proposal, but about the way the conversation unfolded without proper sensitivity toward the children involved. For years, Catherine has reportedly worked tirelessly to create a sense of normality around George, Charlotte, and Louis, despite the enormous pressure of royal life. The thought that palace officials were already categorizing her children according to future institutional usefulness allegedly left her deeply shaken. Particularly because she understands better than most how quickly public roles inside the monarchy can begin shaping personal identity. And hanging over the entire crisis was the shadow nobody inside the palace could ignore: Prince Harry. According to insiders, William repeatedly drew painful parallels between the proposed structure for Louis and the emotional fractures that eventually consumed his relationship with his younger brother. The spare dynamic has haunted the royal family for generations, creating invisible hierarchies that often leave siblings trapped between privilege and exclusion. William reportedly became determined that Louis would never grow up feeling secondary, expendable, or institutionally sidelined in the same way many believe Harry ultimately did. That fear transformed the debate from political disagreement into something far more emotional and dangerous. Because now the future king was no longer merely defending royal tradition. He was defending his children against a system he incurred, seizingly feared could damage them from within, and as senior officials scrambled to contain the growing unrest inside palace walls, whispers began circulating about another deeply unsettling detail tied to the entire controversy, one involving Princess Charlotte directly. But as whispers spread through royal corridors, another shocking detail emerged, one involving Princess Charlotte directly. Among all three royal children, insiders say it was Charlotte's future that turned the discussion from political disagreement into a deeply personal family crisis, and William's reaction revealed just how protective he has become of his only daughter. As palace tensions deepened behind closed doors, reports began surfacing that Princess Charlotte had quietly become one of the monarchy's most significant figures, far more significant than many outsiders realized. According to royal insiders, senior aides have privately viewed Charlotte for years as a stabilizing force for the future of the crown. Her growing public popularity, her confidence during royal appearances, and her striking resemblance in temperament to both Princess Anne and the late Queen Elizabeth II reportedly made her uniquely valuable. Silence, the kind able to the institution's image. Some palace staff even whispered that Charlotte possessed what they described as natural royal instinct, a quality difficult to manufacture and impossible to teach. And yet, despite that admiration, it was precisely her future role that allegedly became one of the most divisive topics inside the confidential council discussions. Various interpretations of the meeting now suggest advisors raised the possibility that Charlotte, despite her popularity, might eventually need to maintain a more limited public role within a streamlined monarchy. To William, that idea reportedly felt both contradictory and deeply unfair. Because unlike previous generations, Charlotte had already become enormously beloved by the public while still incredibly young. Polling analysts and royal commentators frequently compared her appeal to the enduring respect once commanded by Princess Anne's steady, composed, dutiful, and increasingly viewed as emotionally grounding within the Wales family dynamic. Others even noted echoes of Queen Elizabeth II's calm restraint in Charlotte's public demeanor, which is precisely why the suggestion that she could someday step back into instituty. Silence, the kind only allegedly triggered such a powerful emotional response from her father. Sources close to the Wales household claim William became increasingly disturbed by the realization that palace officials were already discussing his daughter's future in terms of strategic necessity rather than personal well-being. For him, Charlotte was not simply a royal asset or constitutional figure. She was his child. And insiders whisper that he feared the monarchy's rigid hierarchy could eventually place emotional burdens on her that no young girl should ever have to carry. Especially because Charlotte reportedly shares an unusually close bond with both George and Louis, something William and Catherine have worked tirelessly to protect. The possibility of institutional divisions forming between the children allegedly struck William as the beginning of a much larger danger, one capable of quietly reshaping the entire family from within. Catherine's concerns reportedly became even more personal. According to palace whispers, the Princess of Wales has long been fiercely protective of Charlotte's emotional stability, particularly as public fascination surrounding the young princess continues growing. Silence, the kind worldwide. Unlike previous generations of royal women raised almost entirely within palace systems, Catherine has reportedly tried to ensure Charlotte experiences as much normality as possible, despite her extraordinary position. School routines, family time, a sense of emotional safety away from royal expectations, but insiders now claim Catherine feared those protections could slowly collapse if palace politics began defining Charlotte's future too early. Because once royal institutions begin assigning roles to children, innocence disappears quickly. And then came the rumor that deeply unsettled almost everyone connected to the family. Multiple sources began quietly suggesting Charlotte may have overheard fragments of adult conversations connected to the growing controversy. Reports remain unconfirmed, but insiders claim there were concerns she had become aware that discussions involving her future responsibilities were taking place behind closed doors. For William, that possibility reportedly became unbearable. Witnesses close to the situation now suggest his anger intensified dramatically once fears emerged that the children themselves could begin sensing tension inside the family structure. The future king allegedly became enraged by any suggestion that Charlotte should someday reduce her visibility or step back for institutional convenience. To him, it reportedly sounded less like modernization and more like emotional sacrifice disguised as strategy. As a result, tensions inside the royal household reportedly escalated rapidly. Conversations between senior aides became colder. Trust inside certain palace departments began quietly fracturing. And according to insiders, William's relationship with parts of the royal bureaucracy entered dangerous territory for the very first time. Because the debate was no longer theoretical, it had become painfully personal. And within the House of Windsor, personal conflicts rarely remain contained for long, especially when they involve the future king, the future queen, and the children standing directly in line behind them. And then came the moment that transformed a private disagreement into an all-out royal rupture. Witnesses say the atmosphere inside the chamber turned icy the instant William stood up. Chairs shifted. Papers were abandoned mid-discussion. And before anyone could stop him, the heir to the throne Delhi. Silence, the kind verted a response that reportedly stunned even the most seasoned palace veterans. According to multiple palace insiders, the confrontation that followed was unlike anything senior royal staff had witnessed from Prince William in years. For decades, the future king has carefully maintained an image of discipline, restraint, and controlled composure in public and private alike. Even during moments of extraordinary pressure surrounding the monarchy, William reportedly understood the unspoken rule that governs royal survival above all else. Emotions stay hidden, conflict stays private. But sources now claim something inside that chamber finally pushed him beyond the limits of royal restraint. And once that line was crossed, the carefully managed calm surrounding the institution began fracturing in real time. Reports suggest William rejected the proposal immediately and without compromise. Witnesses familiar with the meeting allege he interrupted senior advisors before they could finish outlining long-term recommendations connected to Charlotte and Louis. Various interpretations of the exchange differ in detail, but insiders consistently describe the same emotional undercurrent anger mix. Silence, the kind ed with disbelief. One source claimed William could not understand how discussions involving his children's future roles had advanced so far without his direct involvement earlier in the process. Another described the atmosphere as deeply hostile, with several officials visibly shaken by the intensity of the confrontation unfolding behind closed doors. As tensions escalated, insiders whisper that William allegedly accused certain palace figures of deliberately targeting his children under the guise of modernization. That accusation reportedly sent shockwaves through the room, because inside royal institutions, language matters enormously. Suggesting that advisors were strategically isolating Charlotte and Louis implied something far more dangerous than policy disagreement. It implied betrayal from within the very system entrusted to protect the future of the monarchy. And according to reports, once William framed the issue that way, the discussion stopped being administrative entirely. It became personal warfare. Veteran palace officials were reportedly stunned by the depth of emotion William displayed throughout the exchange. Those who have worked around the Prince of Wales for silence, the kind our years allegedly described the reaction as highly unusual, particularly given his reputation for measured control under pressure. But others quietly noted the similarities between William's frustrations and struggles King Charles himself reportedly faced throughout much of his life as Prince of Wales. For decades, Charles often battled tensions with palace bureaucracy, courtiers, and institutional expectations that limited his authority even as heir to the throne. And now, according to insiders, William appeared to be colliding with that same machinery himself, only this time the issue involved his children directly. While the argument continued behind closed doors, reports suggest aides outside the chamber immediately sensed the situation spiraling beyond normal palace disagreement. Staff allegedly moved quickly to limit hallway access, redirect conversations, and contain speculation before information spread further across royal residences. Yet despite those efforts, whispers traveled fast. Particularly after Catherine was reportedly seen leaving the area separately later that evening, visibly shaken by the confrontation that had unfolded. Sources close to the Princess of Wales. Silence, the Kindees claimed the emotional weight of the situation affected her deeply, especially as concerns grew over how the mounting tensions could eventually impact George, Charlotte, and Louis personally. Within hours, palace communications teams were reportedly placed under extraordinary pressure to ensure no details from the confrontation reached the media. Staff were allegedly instructed not to discuss the incident externally under any circumstances, while senior officials worked frantically to reinforce internal confidentiality protocols. But by that stage, the damage may already have been done. Royal correspondents and longtime media insiders soon began noticing unusual signs of tension surrounding the Wales household. Scheduling inconsistencies, abrupt communication delays, carefully worded palace briefings that seemed unusually defensive. To experienced observers, it became increasingly obvious that something serious had erupted behind the scenes. And perhaps most dangerously of all, the confrontation exposed a reality the palace has spent generations trying to avoid. The future king was no longer willing to quietly absorb institutional decisions he believed threatened his family. That SIF terrified many inside the monarchy, because once internal trust begins collapsing between heirs and the royal machine itself, history shows the consequences can become impossible to control. And as officials scrambled desperately to contain the fallout from William's explosive reaction, another question began quietly circulating through royal corridors and media offices alike. One question nobody inside Windsor seemed prepared to answer. But while the palace scrambled to contain the fallout, another question quietly emerged: who leaked the story in the first place? Royal leaks are nothing new, but this time was different. Because according to insiders, the information escaping the palace wasn't accidental, it appeared deliberate, and that possibility terrified senior officials. Within less than 48 hours of the explosive Windsor confrontation, whispers that should have remained buried deep inside royal walls began surfacing across media circles with startling precision. At first, the reports appeared vague. Royal correspondents hinted at serious internal disagreements involving succession planning and future roles within the monarchy. But then the details became sharp. References to Charlotte and Louis quietly emerged. Mentions of William's anger started circulating among journalists known for their long-standing palace connections. And according to insiders, panic spread rapidly through royal communications offices the moment senior staff realized confidential discussions from inside the private council chamber were somehow reaching the outside world. What made the situation especially dangerous was the belief among palace officials that the leak did not resemble a careless breach or accidental whisper. Reports suggest the information was released selectively, strategically, and with remarkable timing. Certain details remained hidden while others appeared almost deliberately framed to maximize tension surrounding the Wales family. That realization triggered immediate alarm inside the institution. Because within royal systems, intentional leaks are rarely random acts of gossip. They are weapons, signals, pressure tactics deployed quietly behind layers of plausible deniability. And according to multiple palace sources, the possibility that factions inside the monarchy itself were manipulating the narrative created an atmosphere of outright paranoia. Palace communications teams reportedly launched urgent internal investigations almost immediately. Staff movements were quietly reviewed. Access logs surrounding the Windsor meeting allegedly became subject to scrutiny. Senior aides were reminded about confidentiality obligations in unusually direct terms. Yet despite those efforts, the leaks continued spreading. Royal editors at major newspapers began hinting at deepening instability surrounding the future structure of the monarchy, while commentators close to palace networks started discussing growing divisions between William and senior institutional advisors. The palace publicly maintained silence, but privately, insiders claim officials were scrambling desperately to identify where the information flow had begun. Competing theories quickly emerged. Some insiders allegedly believed factions within the institution were attempting to politically weaken William before his eventual accession by portraying him as emotionally volatile and resistant to modernization. According to this theory, the leaks served a strategic purpose: to pressure the future king into accepting institutional reforms by making opposition appear unreasonable or emotionally driven. Others, however, suspected the exact opposite. Whispers circulated that loyalists sympathetic to William and Catherine may have intentionally leaked fragments of the story in order to protect Charlotte and Louis from decisions being quietly finalized behind closed doors. By exposing the internal conflict publicly, they may have hoped to force the palace into retreat before irreversible changes could be implemented. For William, the situation reportedly became infuriating on multiple levels. Sources close to the Wales household claim he was deeply angered not only by the original proposal, but by the fact private conversations involving his children had now become subjects of media speculation. The future king has spent years trying to shield George, Charlotte, and Louis from the harshest realities of royal life. Yet suddenly, The exact machinery he feared most, the palace rumor network, the anonymous briefings, the strategic leaks appeared to be circling his family directly. Insiders whisper that William began growing increasingly distrustful of palace structures that once felt dependable to him. Every conversation, every staff interaction, silence, the kind now meeting allegedly became shadowed by suspicion. Catherine's concerns reportedly intensified even further. According to royal insiders, the Princess of Wales became increasingly uneasy about the scale of internal information circulating through palace staff networks. For years, she reportedly approached royal life with caution, discipline, and a strong awareness of how quickly media narratives can spiral beyond control. But the latest developments allegedly shook her confidence deeply, particularly because comparisons to Harry and Meghan's highly publicized battles with palace briefing culture began resurfacing almost immediately across royal commentary. Once again, the monarchy appeared trapped in a cycle where private tensions leaked outward until family relationships became a public spectacle. And for Catherine, that possibility represented one of her greatest fears for her children's future. As headlines intensified and speculation spread, palace officials continued insisting the institution remained stable. But behind the carefully controlled statements and formal silence, insiders now describe an atmosphere dominated by fear, mistrust, and emotional exhaustion. Because the silence, the kind deeper the leak investigation went, the more obvious it became that this crisis was no longer confined to institutional politics alone. The damage had already crossed into something far more personal and far more painful for the Wales family themselves. Yet behind the public headlines, the greatest damage was unfolding inside William and Catherine's private world. Away from the cameras, the future king and queen reportedly faced one heartbreaking reality. Their children were no longer being protected from the machinery of the crown. And according to those close to the family, that realization changed everything. In the days following the leak crisis and the explosive confrontation at Windsor, insiders say a profound shift quietly began taking place inside the Wales household. Publicly, William and Catherine continued fulfilling their responsibilities with the same controlled composure expected of senior royals. Appearances remained polished. Statements remained measured. But behind closed doors, sources close to the family whisper that both parents were grappling with a deeply painful question. How do you raise children inside an institution that may already be deciding their emotions? Now futures for them? That question reportedly haunted nearly every conversation taking place within their private circle. Because for the first time, the threat no longer felt distant or theoretical. It had become immediate, personal, impossible to ignore. According to palace insiders, William and Catherine allegedly began reassessing nearly every aspect of how George, Charlotte, and Louis would be exposed to royal life moving forward. Discussions reportedly intensified around limiting public appearances for Charlotte and Louis in particular, especially after concerns emerged that internal palace politics could eventually place unhealthy pressure on them as they grow older. Sources suggest the couple feared that too much visibility too early could deepen institutional labels already quietly forming around the children inside certain royal circles. And for William especially, the possibility of history repeating itself within his own family became emotionally unbearable. Catherine's role during this period reportedly became even more focused on preserving stability and normality around the children, despite the growing chaos surrounding the monarchy. Those close to the princess, silence, the kind of Wales say she remained determined to protect family routines from the emotional turbulence unfolding behind palace walls. School schedules, family dinners, quiet weekends away from official duties. Small moments that, to most people, might seem ordinary suddenly became essential acts of protection inside a life shaped by extraordinary pressure. Because Catherine reportedly understood something the institution often forgets. Children do not experience monarchy as strategy or constitutional structure. They experience tension emotionally, quietly, and sometimes permanently. At the center of William's fears, however, remained the growing shadow of the spare dynamic that has haunted royal history for generations. Insiders claim the Prince of Wales became increasingly determined that Louis would never feel emotionally secondary to George, no matter how rigid royal hierarchy eventually became. The scars left behind by the breakdown between William and Harry reportedly shaped much of his thinking throughout the crisis. He had witnessed firsthand how dangerous institutional imbalance can become when one sibling carries the weight of destiny while another struggles to define purpose with system. And according to sources close to the family, William now viewed protecting Louis emotionally as one of the defining responsibilities of his future reign. At the same time, reports suggest Prince George himself had become increasingly aware that something unusual was happening around him. Though still young, insiders whisper the future heir had started noticing shifts in mood, conversations abruptly ending when children entered rooms, and mounting media attention surrounding the family. That realization reportedly broke William's heart more than anything else, because the future king has long tried to shield George from the overwhelming burden of royal expectation for as long as possible. Yet now, the machinery of succession was slowly revealing itself around him whether his parents wanted it to or not. Meanwhile, tensions between William and certain senior royal officials reportedly continued worsening behind the scenes. Trust had been damaged, perhaps permanently. Sources claim the Prince of Wales grew increasingly guarded around palace advisors, particularly those believed to support aggressive modernization strategies tied to Charlotte and Louis. And as internal silence, the kind divisions deepened, many insiders quietly began recognizing a far larger truth emerging from the crisis. The future survival of the monarchy itself may ultimately depend on how William and Catherine's children are treated during these formative years, because public sympathy had already begun shifting dramatically toward the Wales family. To many observers, William and Catherine no longer appeared merely as senior royals managing institutional tension. They looked like parents trying desperately to protect their children from the emotional cost of the crown. And as public support around them intensified, one final reality slowly became impossible for the palace to deny. The monarchy was no longer simply managing a disagreement over titles or future roles. It was confronting a deeper question about its own humanity and whether the institution could evolve before history repeated itself yet again. And as the dust finally began to settle, one final truth became impossible for the palace to ignore. What began as a private discussion about titles may ultimately reshape the monarchy for an entire generation. Because after William's explosive reaction, palace insiders say one thing became unmistakably clear. The future king is prepared to fight for his children at any cost. In the aftermath of the crisis, a subtle but undeniable transformation reportedly began unfolding inside the House of Windsor. For years, Prince William had carefully balanced two identities that often pull in opposite directions: the dutiful heir raised to protect the institution, and the father determined to shield his family from the emotional burdens that institution can create. But according to insiders, the confrontation over Charlotte and Louis forced those two worlds into direct collision. And from that moment forward, palace officials allegedly realized something had fundamentally changed. William was no longer simply preparing to inherit the monarchy. He was beginning to redefine the terms under which he would lead it. Reports suggest senior courtiers quickly noticed the shift in his approach. Conversations became sharper, boundaries became firmer. The future king reportedly grew more assertive in challenging internal recommendations connected to his family, particularly those involving the children's future public roles. For decades, royal heirs traditionally learned to accommodate the silence, the kind machinery surrounding them, even when personal feelings conflicted with institutional priorities. But insiders now whisper that William increasingly refuses to separate fatherhood from duty. To him, the future of the crown cannot come at the emotional expense of his children, and that belief may now sit at the heart of one of the most important internal struggles the monarchy has faced in generations. At the center of the conflict lies a growing divide between two entirely different visions of royal life. One side remains rooted in the old palace system, a structure built on hierarchy, sacrifice, and institutional survival above personal comfort. The other reflects a far more modern approach to parenting and family, shaped heavily by William and Catherine's determination to raise their children with emotional stability, closeness, and as much normality as possible. Insiders claim this philosophical clash has quietly intensified for years beneath the surface of royal operations. But the controversy surrounding Charlotte and Louis finally exposed it completely. Because once discussions about titles became discussions about childhood, the debate stopped being constitutional and became silence, the kind deeply human. Meanwhile, George, Charlotte, and Louis themselves have now reportedly become central symbols in the monarchy's future direction. Public fascination surrounding the Wales children has only intensified as reports of palace tension spread across media outlets worldwide. And increasingly, the public appears to view William and Catherine less as rigid defenders of royal tradition and more as parents trying to navigate an institution capable of extraordinary pressure. Sympathy has reportedly shifted heavily toward the Wales family, particularly among younger audiences who see echoes of past royal tragedies beginning to surface once again. To many observers, the conflict no longer represents a debate over royal titles alone. It represents a test of whether the monarchy has truly learned from its own history. At the same time, King Charles reportedly remains caught in an increasingly painful position between institutional modernization and family unity. Sources close to palace operations suggest the king understands the long-term pressures driving calls for a smaller monarchy. Yet insiders also claim he recognizes the emotional dangers now threatening his relationship with silence, the kind William if the situation continues escalating. That tension has reportedly forced senior advisors to reconsider succession planning strategies far more carefully than before. Because once public confidence becomes tied to the emotional well-being of the next royal generation, every decision suddenly carries far greater consequences. And perhaps most remarkably of all, Charlotte and Louis have unintentionally become symbols of a much larger question facing the monarchy itself. Can the institution evolve enough to protect the humanity of those born inside it? Reports suggest many within palace circles now privately acknowledge that the future survival of the crown may depend less on ceremonial tradition and more on whether younger royals are allowed to grow into adulthood without repeating the emotional fractures that haunted previous generations. William reportedly understands that danger more clearly than anyone. He has lived beside it his entire life. Because inside the House of Windsor, legacy has always demanded sacrifice. Duty has always come before comfort, and silence has often protected the institution at the cost of the individuals living within it. But now, according to the sesh watching this crisis unfold behind palace walls, the future king appears prepared to challenge that balance entirely. Not to destroy the monarchy, but to protect his family from becoming consumed by it. And if that determination continues shaping William's path toward the throne, the monarchy emerging in the years ahead may look profoundly different from the one that came before. Because inside the House of Windsor, titles may define status, but for Prince William, this battle was never about protocol. It was about protecting his children from becoming casualties of the crown itself. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.